everybody. Today we are going to work through Trigger 2 by Steven Slate. We're going to figure out how it works, different workflows inside of Pro Tools, when to use it, maybe when not to use it, and how to build your own samples that are layered and dense so we can kind of recreate realistic but powerful drums from basically any recording. I'm going to be working with a track that was sent to me recently. It's a great track, good mics, good drummer. But in order to kind of take it up to that next level, I'm going to first show you how to work Trigger. And then later in another video, I'll show you how I'm going to mix those and how I'm going to approach those using a combination of the original recording, the live drums, and some samples that I've captured that I've actually created those samples, so they are also live drums with live mics, but have a couple of benefits. One of the big things you can do with triggers versus the live mics is you can get rid of bleed. And if there's no bleed, you can do all sorts of EQ. When there's a hi-hat showing up in your snare mic, if you try to boost a bunch of high end into it to make it really snap, you're going to find out that suddenly you've made your hi-hat cymbal the trashiest thing in the world. Because using a 57 from the wrong angle is a terrible way to record a hi-hat. And so by using this trigger, as well as maybe like some gates or something on the live snare, we're able to get rid of some of that bleed, if not all of it. And then that gives us the ability to turn up the actual hi-hat mic or the overheads more to have a more controlled, more pleasant version of that instrument. Another thing you can do with samples is you can make things more consistent. If you want to. If you have a great drummer with a lot of nuance, you can use triggers carefully to try to recreate that nuance so you're blending in with their original performance. And how hard you hit a snare drum is a really important feature of a great drummer, being able to balance the kit internally, meaning they're hitting it all at the right volume, versus waiting for someone like me to come back in and try to fix all their mistakes. Trigger can sometimes be a lifesaver if your drummer is inconsistent and yet needs to sound consistent. I'll be using my triggers a lot in those cases so that I can have them play back at a consistent volume. And also sometimes helps a lot, like I just said, with the bleed issue, where if you have a drummer that hits their cymbals really hard but hits their drums kind of soft, I can use a sample or a trigger of a much harder hit on the drum, and then I'm not going to have to worry about trying to compress the drum super hard to make it sound like it was hit hard, because I will just naturally have that as an option on a fader. So we'll dive in. I'm going to show you a couple of ways to work through it, but I'm going to start with the super easy way to use it, and we'll work up to the correct way to use it. And here we go. So I'll jump back over to my screen here. And just so you know what we're working on, this is the track. There's a bunch of guitars, some keyboard kind of stuff. This isn't a final, we've still got a vocal to go, but here we go. So there's that. And sounds good. Clean tracks. It's definitely an amazing drummer. Very, very tight, very clean. His timing is good. He's consistent. When he wants to hit hard, he does. Like in this little intro fill to the chorus, you can tell those are definitely hit harder, and you can even see him on the waveform. But then in between, he's very consistent and hits accents when he wants to hit accents. He only sent me one snare track. He has a snare top mic, and often we'd see like a snare bottom. And then this other one down here labeled snare 2 is an entirely different drum. And so I have strip silenced manually, just muted all the clips where he's not playing. And this is kind of like an effect meant to kind of go small and then big. Just in case you were wondering, Command M is the mute clip shortcut. So I would go in and let me kind of reset this. I would go in, find the edge of it, hit B to break it, G to do a little fade out, and then Command M to mute that section. So I just did that the whole way through. And yeah, so let's dive in. I've got kick in, sub kick, one snare mic, that second snare, hi-hats, toms, overheads, a mono overhead, which sounds to me more like a ribbon mic or something like that. Some room mics. Different set of room mics. And a smashy mic. Kind of just a single mic, grabbing the whole kit with a bunch of compression, add some anger. All right, so first thing I did was the groups that I was sent were kind of funky. So first thing I'm gonna do is create some track groups, Command G, and I always do the same groups in the same order, and I'm gonna create a group here for one mic because in a second I'm gonna have more than one snare set up. And I always do kick, snare, toms, and then I will grab all of the drums and create it. And by doing that, I have group A, B, C, and D. And at any point when I'm in this window, I can disable my drum group by just pressing D. And then I'm out of the group, press D again, I'm back in. D for drums. So that's going to be pretty handy. And because it's always the same on every session I do, if somebody sends me a track with different groups, I might just delete them and make my own because it saves me a lot of time. Okay. So ordinarily, I might do a little bit of rough mixing and something here, but in this case, I'm just going to jump right into trigger because I want to show you how that works. Hit D, turn off the drum group. Now I can just solo my snare, and here we go. So here's the snare channel. Nothing on it. This is how it was recorded. So trigger 2 shows up under the dynamics section right here. And there's two versions of it. There's the mono version, which this is a mono source track, or there's a mono/stereo, which means it's going to take your mono track and give you a stereo output. In most cases with samples, we're going to want that because a lot of times the samples are sampling like the overheads and the room mics from the original sound. And so that's what I did. And if you notice, the output of that track changed to 2 meters, which means it's got a stereo output, but it still only has like a mono input. So if I drop it right on there and just hit play, you will see these show up. That's the original snare drum. If I bypass this, or I can take the mix knob and dial it back. That's now the original snare only, and you can see how those line up. So this is going to function kind of like a compressor where you have a threshold, and if it crosses that threshold, it starts to work. And so in this case, the threshold is called detail. There are times when the drummer's playing a lot of tiny ghost notes, and if I shut up, you can hear them. You can tell he's kind of just barely tapping his stick on the drum. Pop, pop. And so those little tiny ghost notes, in some cases, I would need to try to sample them. If I'm going to fully replace this drum, I need to recreate the entire groove he was playing. And in this case, I'm going to keep that from the original drum and lean on the sample just for the big accent hits. So I don't have to worry about it. So in my situation, I can adjust my detail up here somewhere and not have to worry at all about whether it grabs on these quieter signals, like it mistriggers based on some smaller instrument. But if I were to go too low on the detail, and then sensitivity, somewhat like ratio, it might give me all sorts of extra little samples here. But that's what I would have to do if I wanted to grab those ghost notes. So I don't. Raise my detail, and this should be nice and easy. Back to kind of my default settings. The retrigger knob here is trying to prevent extra samples. Sometimes with a kick drum, you'll get a little like a poof as the hit happens, and then the sustain in the body of the drum builds up, or maybe after a compression that you tracked with, it kind of pumps a little bit. Sometimes it can detect that as a second hit. So this retrigger, if you know your drummer is never doing flams, which on the kick drum pretty much nobody does, you can set your retrigger way up, and then it will never give you a flam or two hits almost on top of each other. But in this snare drum track, the first couple hits are flams. You can hear how they go prung, prung. That's because there's two tiny waveforms stacked up. He hit it with both drumsticks in order to get that effect. You can see that hit and that hit. It's a little clearer on that last one. And so if I wanted to get rid of those, I could raise this and you'd see only one line for each of those hits. But I want to leave them in because that's part of the performance. Another cool feature before I actually get into the samples is that if you turn the mix all the way down, you can use this nice gate. This is not in every version of Trigger. There's a free version of Trigger you can get, and it gives you a handful of samples you can use, and it will not include this gate. But the paid version, which a lot of times is somewhere between $50 and $100, has this great gate, and it's a really impressive. Let me skip up to where there's more snare hits. Super tight, triggers really well, but you can tell it's entirely eliminated those ghost notes that are happening, but it did eliminate the bleed. So there's going to be times when ghost notes are not an issue and you want a super tight snare drum. This is a really nice gate for that. Unlike most gates though, it doesn't have a range knob. So it's either all or nothing. It's a full-on gate, no expansion, no like subtle gating. It's in or out. So in this case, I'm just not going to use it. And I'm going to crank my mix all the way back up. And now I need it to play something. So on Trigger 2, you have 8 slots here where you can load different samples. And you can tell it where to look for samples in this settings base directory. And I have mine already pointed at a folder of my own that I keep, an ongoing folder of samples and loops and stuff. And then to get to them, you go to the browser, which takes you to that folder. Trigger 2 comes with these. And so there's a bunch of different types. You can grab, how about a Chili Peppers kind of snare? And I can go to Chili Snare Z1, Z2, Z3. These are just different versions of it. And if you turn on this Audition, you can just click on it and you'll hear it. And then I go to triggering and I'm going to hit play. And you hear that every time it detects an incoming signal, it's going to play that sample. But that's not the right one. So let's try something else. How about black snare? Nope. Maybe that one. And again, you know, you want to try to match up the original snare if it's good. If it's bad and you're trying to replace it, sometimes that's what we got to do. And just keep in mind that that bad sounding snare that the drummer brought is going to also be in the overheads, also going to be in the room mics. So if you'd replace it with something entirely different, it's not likely to gel. So you would want to find something better but similar in most cases. So here's the original. Not super similar. Let's try again. Or maybe this one. Nope. So you kind of get to know your library and you'll start reaching for certain ones over and over again. Ooh, that one's ringy. But in our case, what I'm going to do, well, let's just pick one. I like that Dream snare well enough. I'll show you the other system in a minute. So then, boom. Those are not close mics. That's a close mic, but that is a room mic. So why don't I try to make a little bit of space along with my sample, and I'll put those down on these next two tracks, and then I can use the mixer to blend them. So I'll have this dry hit, blend in just enough of the rooms so it doesn't sound dry, but not so much that it makes it washy, because that sounds pretty cool, but once you get guitars going, it's going to sound really weak and not snappy or punchy. Sure. Other features we have in here is a polarity flip. Sometimes the original drum was tracked out of phase and the sample's in phase, or maybe your sample is out of phase and the original drum was in phase. You can flip all the phases, or if you're using multiple samples, like I can use that Dream snare, but I could also blend in a little bit of the Jimmy snare. And maybe I like that texture or whatever a little bit differently. And if they're out of phase with each other, you can flip them and then they'll line back up, which is super important that that works. Another thing you can do, I'm going to clear that slot. Right click to clear the slot, option click to clear all of them, and we just learned that together. The other thing you can do is you can tune it. So I'm going to link the tuning, and then all of these will tune at the same amount. So let's listen to our original one more time. That one's up here. That one's down there. So what I can do, just kind of by ear usually. Yep, much more similar from the original, and that's going to make a big difference when you're lining it up with the overheads and the room mics. You're not going to hear two different types of tones or ranges for your snare drum. It'll all be in one spot. They'll merge together much better, which is most of drum mixing, is trying to get stuff to blend together. So that's the really basic version of how this works. Each of these samples can be layered, which means if you play a really soft hit, you will get a really soft tonality. As I click higher up in this window, you start to hear what happens when it thinks the drummer hit really hard. So that's a more aggressive hit. And it's not just volume. The speed the drummer hits with the stick actually makes it a much more clicky and brighter as it gets hit harder. And it kind of shuts down the sustain a little bit because it dampens the head just a tiny bit. When you hit soft, it tends to be more buzzy because of the snare wires and a little more gentle. I don't know. It's just a different feeling emotionally. And so it works. And that's an important part of recreating the full drum kit. Another thing you can do, if you notice, this isn't just tone, it's also volume. A hard hit sounds much louder. But maybe your drummer wasn't consistent with volume and you don't want Trigger to recreate their volume accurately. You want to recreate it more consistently. So there's a couple of controls in this View Curves window, and you can link these things so it does all the tracks at the same time, which I'm going to do because I want each of these samples are all from the same sample pack, and I want them all to be the same. ASR stands for Attack, Sustain, Release. So attack is how quickly the sample will fade in at the beginning. Generally, your samples that you get will already have a tiny fade in, so you would want none from Trigger. But maybe you grab a bad sample from somewhere that sounds really cool, but it's got a click at the beginning. you can set the attack time to like 1 millisecond, and it'll put a tiny little millisecond fade in there. Or maybe you have a room mic. I'll turn off my link. Maybe you have a room mic that's kind of covering up the snap of your drum. You could turn up the attack to 50, 75 milliseconds, and then that mic will fade in instead of hitting hard, and might bring out a little more snap from your track. Sustain is how long the sample will play for, and release is how quickly it will fade out at the end of the sample. So maybe you have a sample that's like 3 seconds long with a bunch of tape hiss or room noise or something like that. This would allow you to kind of control the fade out. The sustain is how long it'll stay at full volume, and then the release is going to kind of ramp down. Generally, I'm not messing with these unless I'm really trying to screw with a room mic to make it more interesting or something. Sometimes I'll make them sound like a gated reverb where the room mic will go pop and just all the way stop. Instead of pow, it goes pop and just chops. Dynamics. Dynamics is the volume of your samples. So if I change this to 0, these soft hits are the same volume as these loud hits. They still sound different. The texture is different, but the volume is the same. And then velocity is how hard it was hit on a scale of 0 to 127. So this is MIDI velocity, which you probably already know about. MIDI velocity is a range of volumes, and if you play the piano a little harder, you get a higher velocity assigned to each note. So in this case, Trigger, as it identifies where every hit is assigning it a MIDI velocity, a number that's going to tell it how loud of a sample to play back. And if you'll notice, when I play the quiet hits up here, at a certain point they transition to medium hits, and then they transition up to harder hits. And you can hear a little more stick attack on this than on that. So as you assign a velocity, you'll notice that it kind of ramps up here, and that means more of your hits are going to be assigned to be louder hits. If you ramp it down, more of your hits from the drummer that it detects will get pushed down a little bit, and that's going to make overall the drum performance be more subtle, but still leaving the option for a few super hard hits, maybe as accents in a rather chill ballad or something. Or maybe this is a rock song, and most of your drum hits need to be up here with a few ghost notes and build-ups and stuff like that, drum fills that might have softer hits on purpose. And then, if you want, you can set a range and just say, don't ever play those super hard hits. I want a lot of medium hits, so I'm going to set this range lower, and it's never going to give me the max velocity hits. Maybe there's too much stick click in those, and you want it to be a little more juicy. Or maybe you never want any ghost notes, or you never want anything softer than a max volume hit. You could raise the range way up here, and you'll always get max volume hits, no matter what the drummer actually did. So you have options, and you have the ability to change these things. If necessary, you can even automate them. If you remember plugin automation, you click on the auto here, and any of these things can be automated inside of Pro Tools, which is every control. Channel 1, range bottom, add, and then in my track view, it will show me channel 1, range bottom. There we go. I'm not going to do it, but you could automate from there. So let's call that stage 1. This is putting it right on the snare track, replace it fully, or if you really want to, you can use the mix knob and blend it in and have mostly the original, or all the way up to no original. But because of those ghost notes, if I was going to do it this way, I might blend the mix back most of the way and just get a little bit of extra snap and clarity. Kind of turns down the bleed, but brings a little extra volume and separation from the bleed on the big hits. Okay, so now let's take it to the next level, which is a better way to run it when you're mixing in Pro Tools. So here's my snare track. And because this is a good drummer, I definitely want to preserve everything that he's given me. So what I'm going to do is create a send to a new track. This is definitely the best way to create sends going out to a reverb or going out to any parallel processing. Click on the send, select new track, and then I'm going to call it snare sampler, SN sampler. I'm going to take it to an instrument track, which if you remember, an instrument track is a MIDI track and an aux track combined. So mostly I'm going to be using this for the auxiliary track with just a place to hold a plug in. But at the end of this process, I'm going to show you a really cool feature using MIDI. So create next to current track. Great. Snare sampler. It named it .1 because I already did this once. And command click on that little arrow to drop down. I'm going to send this out at full volume, pre-fader, and for a reason I'll show you later, I'm going to pan it to the left. And then if I hit play, you'll see that it shows up on this stereo instrument track on the left side only. Then I'm going to go add trigger. And also, in case you didn't remember or know, if you're in here and you know you want to get to a certain plugin, you can just type trigger and it will take me right there. Hit enter and it grabs your plugin. Okay, so I know this drummer, and so I am going to grab a sample of his own drum from a Black Beauty. And this guy, .prs, is a preset. .tci is the original like sample file, and it's a layered sample. These are just waves, so every time this is the exact same hit, but on a TCI, it's a layered sample. There's multiple hits at each velocity. So you'll never hear the same sample twice in a row. Kind of prevents that video game character walking into a wall machine gun sample effect. Makes it sound much more natural. So this is a sample I built. I added a couple of things from another sample pack, but I'm going to mute it because I don't need it and I don't want it in my preset. And I'm not soloed. You'll notice that as I hit down at the bottom, it's more gentle. And it gets much more snappy and poppy at the top. There's a couple of layers in here. I'm just going to clear these out for your clarity. I have the close mic sample. Here's without. Then I have the overhead sample, which is super critical. It's not as great sounding on its own, but this has really got a nice click to it, but it could be a little harsh and it would stick out in a mix. So by adding that ambience around it from the overhead mics, I end up with a bigger sound. It sounds wider in the stereo field, but also it sounds wider in time, where the transient gets a little bit smeared and it's not as snappy and like stabby in your ears because it's got a little bit of early reflections and separation from the stick, the actual stick hitting plastic. Then I have room mics. This is probably a combination of all the room mics I used on this day that I grabbed this sample from him. And then I also have this. This is a plate reverb that I built, and it was a really cool effect on one song, so I kept it in the sample. But I don't think I want it today. Today is going to be a little bit bigger and a little less organic or whatever, so probably use a different reverb. So there it is. I've sent it from the original track to a track containing trigger, an aux track or an instrument track, and I'll show you why an instrument is sometimes useful later. Then I load in my sample. I'm going to adjust my detail if I need to. And I don't. I'm keeping it pretty simple. It just automatically works. And I'm keeping the mix at 100% so that as a mixer, I have the ability to blend between live drum I'm going to fix my tuning just a little bit. I've linked them up. And this is potentially even the same drum, definitely the same drummer making this sample. So for all the, purists out there that hate pop music and their artificial things, this is maybe our halfway point where it's actually sounds like him, but it's just a slightly cleaner version of him that I can capture with live cymbals in the same space. And, it's less nuanced, but it's definitely more powerful. And there's a lot of times where those are the choices. You can be subtle and nuanced, or you can make things more extreme, more powerful, more epic. And sometimes I need, every time I need a blend of those, some of each. And as I mix, I could just kind of leave it there. Without it. With it. And just so you can see it one more time, I'm going to repeat that process with the kick drum. Go to the kick in, which has got my best transient, send to a new track, kick, sampler. And just because I like to keep my things together, I'm going to move this over one, pan that to the left, full volume, pre-fader. Then type in trigger. Go to my browser, grab a sample, maybe this one. Let's see where. I don't know that I have a kick from Steve. Here's one. Here's the original kick. And there's my sample. I'm going to get rid of some of these room mics. And we'll just rebuild this, make a balance that fits this song. There's the kick. There we go. I had one that I missed. And you can hear again, close mic, sounds pretty good and tight, but a little bit artificial. Blend in the overheads, and it really opens up, makes it sound a lot more like a real drum kit. It's kind of chunky on there, and it ruins the punch of the low end. So generally speaking, if I'm doing samples on a kick, it's going to be less roomy than maybe samples on a snare. Far room. That one is less chunky, adds a little depth, so depth means bigness. So I'm going to bigify it. And then you can do weird stuff with the tuning on these too, like pitch something way up or way down. So sometimes I'll grab a sample and layer it, like adds a little airiness, a little puffiness to it, which might be cool. Here's a mono smash mic. Very crunchy, adds a texture. Might need it for some tracks, but probably not much on this one. This one is, let me put the tuning back. This is a spring reverb, which I had for some reason on some song, but not today. Here's my original. Check my polarity maybe. Gets kind of funky when you do this. So definitely keeping it the way it was. Here's the original kick and snare. And maybe here's just only kick and snare samples. Still not quite as authentic as I might like, but they sound pretty real. But when you start layering in the originals, it sounds like a drummer. And the little bleed, the little bit of inconsistency definitely helps keep it authentic feeling. Then let's look at another feature. Sometimes in a snare track, let me pull this up, especially if they have a bottom mic that's very close to the kick drum, you might notice that you're trying to grab ghost notes and it keeps firing samples based on every kick hit. This happens on snare when you have a bottom mic. It also happens on toms a lot, where let me dig into this tom here and see what happens. Sometimes floor tom is the one that does it. Now let's try it on this floor tom. And repetition is good, so send to a new track. Let's call this Tom 2 sampler. Option click to turn it up, pan it left, pre-fader. Click up there, trigger 2. Let me grab a sample. Keep it on that same kit, Tom 2. I don't know if this is the right sample, but we're not worried about that right now. So in this opening section of the song, that's the original, and you can hear that the drummer's got a lot of stuff going on. Playing very soft notes. So I need Trigger, the samples, to be grabbing some of those. But that's too much. Raise my detail. Hear those double hits that are going ba-da-da-ba-da. So I'm going to raise my re-trigger so it doesn't give me any flams. And it's still going a little bit nuts. If I raise the detail, I miss some of the notes. If I lower the detail, I start getting extras. So here's where that other part comes in handy. Remember, we panned it to the left. I'm going to option drag this tom sampler over to the kick drum, and I'm going to pan it to the right. So now the kick track is sending to the kick sampler, and it's also sending to the right side of the tom sampler. And my tom sampler is sending to the left. So now if you look in the input section here, throughout that, you'll see signals coming in on the right or on the left. So what we can do is use this suppression knob, and anytime the kick drum happens, you see a red thing fly up. And every time that red happens, that means a kick happened at the same time as the tom, or at the same time as maybe a fake tom where the bleed mistriggered. And so the suppression knob will help eliminate those hits. And then I can set my detail lower without getting any fake hits, because every time the kick happens, it's canceling out a potential mistrigger. So it'll allow me to kind of have my detail down in an area where the kicks might have given me a false sample, but now they won't, because it's going to ignore them. But you may have noticed, like I did, that it still is not an amazing sample through here. I think snare is giving me some of those mistriggers, so I can do the same thing from the snare track. I can send it to the right side of the tom trigger, and now it'll ignore any snare or kick hit. We're getting really close. Yeah, that's really close. Okay, so now one more thing we can do to make this even more precise. So down at the bottom, you'll see this section labeled MIDI capture. And what I'm going to do is use this instrument track to capture the MIDI from the original trigger or the original detection. And I'm going to play this section through front to back. With the window open, I cleared the buffer, meaning it forgot all the MIDI that it's ever learned. And now I'm just going to hit play. So it's basically creating a MIDI note for every one of these little flags that you see up there. I can tell that there's still some mistakes in there, but we're getting much closer. Okay, then I can drag on track. And I'm going to drag it all the way to the beginning. Even if I only captured this section out in the middle, yeah, it has to go all the way to the beginning to like figure out where the timing is. And now see a MIDI note for each one of those. They're grayed out, which means the MIDI is not connecting. And so the solution on any time that happens with MIDI is I'm going to right click up here, go to the instrument section, and tell the MIDI where to go. This is like the I/O for MIDI. I can see that the audio is still happening, but I'm going to turn off these tom sample pieces, and I'm going to instead route the MIDI that we just captured to Tom2 sampler, channel 1. And then I might need to, depending on how your rig is set by default, you may need to set the MIDI input, turn it on, and make the note match whatever the MIDI output was. So in our case, I think I've already fixed this, but by default, sometimes the input will be on a C note and the output will be on a C sharp. So just change them to be the same. And now as I play, I'm no longer getting any audio from the original tom. Now it's playing back purely based on these MIDI notes. So let's get in here so we can edit it. I'm going to change my track view to notes. I like to edit it in this window, not in the MIDI editor window, Control equal, because from here I can see both the original and my MIDI notes. And we'll zoom in on this. And I'm going to listen to the original. Boom, boom, boom. There's 3 hits right there. But on my MIDI, I only see 2. So what do? Fix it. Option drag, create a new MIDI note, line it up really carefully with the transient up above it. And there it is. And you can decide how fussy you want to be. Like there is a tiny little ghost note right there. Or in some cases, I'm only using the trigger really for the accents and I don't need to worry about all these tiny notes. I think that's an extra. Goodbye. I miss that little pickup note right there. I'm gonna zoom in really close because it does make a difference if you're lined up with it or not. I think that's an extra. Woo! No thank you. Goodbye. I'm not even sure if that note's supposed to be there. Command M would just mute it temporarily. Yeah, I don't think it's supposed to be there. Oh, it missed that one because there was probably a kick or a snare happening at the same time. So I'll zoom in, line it up. And then also, like, I could make sure that there's no extra hits kind of out in the middle of nowhere or whatever. So by using MIDI, that really gives me the ability to tweak the timing, the placement, the detection, and remember, it assigns a velocity to each hit. So you can drop down this little automation lane or just change your track view to velocity. And if you do that, you're able to, I don't like looking at all that, so I'm going to do it down here. You're able to grab all these notes and maybe take all of your hard hits that were meant to be accents and make them all fully aggressive, 127 MIDI velocity. Or I could make it more dynamic and grab my lower notes and make them more ghosty, more subtle. But maybe that hit needed to be a little more aggressive. I want that doom, 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 be more consistent. And that needs to be hit harder. So using velocity, I can go through and I can really dial each one. You can even get into your MIDI features, option 0 to do your MIDI editing. And I can go to change velocity and I could make a long buildup. Sometimes a song will have like 4-bar tom buildup where it's like doom, 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 and it works its way up to very, very aggressive. And I could change smoothly from 35 for my low hits all the way to max volume. And that long tom buildup now is suddenly actually building and not kind of bouncing around and being sometimes a little louder, sometimes a little softer based on the drummer's ability. So there's a lot of things you can do to really get in and make sure stuff is super precise. Anybody that's doing live drum stuff in like the metal world will have to get into the MIDI stuff, because anything with a lot of busyness in the drumming will require a little bit better analysis and detection than what Trigger can do on its own, especially with a drummer that's kind of sloppy or not hitting nice and clear and loud. At the end of all this, super easy. You have 2 choices. One, you can freeze it, which will render out that processing and let you unfreeze it later. And so see how it kind of grays out, or browns out in my case, and lets me see the waveform that it's creating. But the nice thing about freezing is that if you decide there's a mistake, you can unfreeze it later and just tweak on it. Or I can get in and right click and hit commit, which will actually render out that audio. I'm going to commit the whole track, tell the source track to hide and make inactive. And then as we get into mixing, you'll have just your audio from your original, your audio from your sample, and you don't have to worry about plugins anymore. You do want to make sure that the balances on your sample layers are all correct. So a lot of people will leave the aux track or the instrument track so that they can retweak the balance of like room mics and that sample. And then sometimes what I'll do is I'll take that even a step further. And if I really want to have control after the fact, but not worry about Trigger, I will solo up maybe my close mic and the overhead and then commit. And then it will give me a version that's only the close sound. And then I'll mute those 2 and I'll commit it again. And then I would get a version that's only room mics. And I'd have 2 audio tracks there, one with just, the dry sound and one with the big ambient sound, and no dry sound. So that's an option as well. And for certain things, it's worth the time and effort to take a few extra steps and go through MIDI or commit down different layers of the sound. And for other projects, that tom that they hit twice in the whole thing, I may not even need to augment the original because the original might not sound very good. And so I might save myself the time spent mixing, trying to make the original sound as good as it can, then layer a new sample along it and then blend them for, song time of about 3 seconds. It's not maybe worth 5 or 10 minutes. But on other days, even such a small little detail is worth the time, depending on kind of the scale of the production and all that, and their budget. Because if they want to do it, they can pay me to do it. So in this song, I would end up with a kick sample, a snare sample. I might even sample something different for this little second snare. And let me play that for you, because it's got a lot of cymbal bleed relative to the amount of snare hit. Probably that kick or that snare was likely over on the hi-hat sides. But another thing I could do with it is just use the gate on trigger 2 and give myself a 0% mix. And now this is the original with just a really tight gate. Much more usable in a mix where I can brighten it. I could get in and add high frequency to it and make it snap a little bit. And not have to worry about that hi-hat popping in. All right. I will make another video after this showing kind of my process of getting into a mix on it. But for now, that is trigger. Oh, crap. I got one more thing to show you, and that is the sample builder. You can build your own samples. So if you're not at all interested, goodbye. But let me show you. This program is called Trigger Instrument Editor 2. It comes free with your paid version of Trigger. And this is what you're looking at behind the scenes, or what you're not looking at behind the scenes of each of those TCI files. So I have a bunch of samples here that I took from a session. I always have a drummer. Anytime I'm planning to do this, I'll have the drummer give me 4 or 6 hard hits. If they're not very consistent, I'll ask for 6, because then I'll take the best 4. A handful of hard hits, then medium hits, then soft hits. And that's how I'm going to build my sample. If they're doing something special, like super ghost notes, barely tapping it, or if they're doing rim shots, I might ask for that as a separate layer so I can tweak in or out of those things. And then I'll kind of label them, consolidate them inside of Pro Tools, and I end up with a list like this. So I've got 4 hard snare hits, and as I click, you can hear each of those. Whop, 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 whop. I can just select them all, and drag them over. And then I have some medium snare hits. They sound similar, but each one is different. And some soft snare hits. And then I don't need 6 velocity layers for what I'm doing, so I'm going to change that to 3 layers. Oh, crap. And 4 round robins. That's how many are going to show up on each velocity layer. So if I'm asking them to do 4 hits, I create 4 round robins, and hard, medium, soft will be these. Come on. Drag them back up there. So if it detects a soft hit, it's going to play this sample. Anything below MIDI velocity 42 gets that sample. Anything in the middle gets that. And any super hard hit will get that. You can hit this button that says calculate velocity, and it's going to average is greater. Oh, that's not how you spell greater. It's cheese greater than the upper velocity layer. Good work. So I could raise this to wherever. It doesn't want to go up that high because it's saying that that's a very hard hit and it's going to go way up. But this kind of gives me my range of soft, medium, hard. And then all I do is hit Save TCI. And I would call this whatever I want to call it based on what it is. And then I'm going to clear all cells. And I'm going to do the same thing again for the overheads. So hard overheads, medium. And after I've got the velocity set, which I don't usually even mess with the velocity much. After I've got that set, I'm not going to touch it again because I want every layer of this same snare to have the same thing, save TCI, and I would call it snare overhead and save it. And then I would go to the room mics, clear out my cells, drag in my new samples, and do that for each, save TCI, snare, room, etc. Load all those in, and then when I get to trigger, it would let me go find, let's go to Lizzie, snare, broadcaster, satellite, clear all slots, yes. Drag snare top. In this song, I did snare top and bottom as separate samples, overheads, rooms, mono overhead, smash. And then I would just mix them. So that's a lot of rooms. I'm going to just get in and dial my balance how I want it. And let's say this is my perfect balance. So once I've got my perfect balance, I can save this as a unique preset, and I could call it whatever I want, Lizzie, ringy, snare. Or I could rebalance it again and get rid of all the room mics, and then I could call it save preset, Lizzie, tight snare. I can save different tone versions or balances of each of them and save me time down the road when I decide to go back in and pull up that sample. That's probably about it. So I will see you all soon.